what is historical fiction? Well, I'm chair of the Historical Writers Association, so I should be able to tell you. And what we've done for our competitions that we run every year, including the Crown Awards for published novels and also our unpublished novels and short story competitions, is always say is the story needs to be set mainly at least 35 years in the past. Now, that used to be what the Crime Writers Association also said. They've now made it 50 years in the past, but personally, I'm quite happy with the 35 years because really you're talking about a sort of generational shift. If you think about what life was like in 1985, if you were writing that today, it would take a lot of that sort of research into a very different world. But of course, then when you're looking at what historical fiction is, it then encompasses this enormous range of writing. So you have the sort of literary fiction of somebody like Hilary Mantel, the sort of literary fiction which closely follows real people in particular times, as she does with the Wolf Hall trilogy. You're talking about any sort of literary fiction that covers ordinary lives in exceptional times. But also, as well, you're talking about all of the other genres of history that you, genres of literature and writing that you run up against in a bookshop. So that can be historical crime, the works of people like, well, me and Andrew Taylor, of course, S.D. Sykes. You're talking about romance. It might be the great adventure writing of somebody like Wilbur or Bernard Cornwall. You can be looking at sort of military Roman adventures, like the sort of thing that Simon Scarrow and Ben Kane write to great acclaim. Dorothy Dunnett actually said once that history is all very well, but it's just the showcase. It's the arena in which your characters will perform and which supplies the conflicts, stresses, dilemmas, and struggles they'll get through. So really, you know, whatever sort of stories you like to write, the past is this enormous fund of stories and ideas and settings which can spark your imagination and take you in any direction. So you could end up in any corner of the bookshop in the end. It is, though, slightly more than that, because whenever we write historical fiction, we are re-examining the past, just as non-fiction writers of history do. And by doing that, we're also looking at our own time. History changes depending on who is looking at it. Now, to an extent, that can be about giving voices to people who the historical records and the history books as such have largely left behind. And it also gives us a sense of perspective. When you're approaching it as a writer or as a reader, you are inevitably thinking about where you've come from and where you are now in the modern day. And what we think about the modern day inevitably influences how we are writing and our particular interests in the period that we're looking at. In terms of the marketplace for historical fiction, it is always popular, and I would think that when we were allowed to go to drinks parties and this sort of thing, I think that every year somebody has come up to me and said, oh, you know, historical fiction, nobody's buying it at the moment, it's all going through a quiet phase. And every year someone has also said historical fiction is getting really hot right now, you know, everybody's trying to buy it. So though there are certain periods which are always very, very popular, Victorian, World War II, Roman, it's often the sorts of periods that were particularly being taught about at school, so some people have some familiarity with. The market is always changing. And in terms of what tends to sell to publishers and in the marketplace, the sort of general commercial rules of publishing apply. So things that are high concept, things that are crime always sells very well. There are certain sorts of books that tend to get a wider audience, and often literary and experimental fiction has to struggle to find a slot there, even if it's written in the currently most popular era of the marketplace. The thing that we do as writers is to try and ignore the market as much as possible. Really, you have to write about what you find fascinating, what drives your curiosity, what drives you to tell a story. You know, what are the stories that you've found that have utterly gripped you, rather than trying to follow any marketplace trends. Apart from anything else, we're always a bit behind the times. You know, so if one book of Victorian crime has done incredibly well, if you then start trying to write in that genre just to get to the marketplace, you'll probably find the market has moved on again by the time you get there. So be led by your impulses and your instincts as a writer, first and foremost. And then in terms of what the market decides to celebrate and spend a lot of money on, well, really, that's all just in the lap of the gods. I think, you know, waiting for the planets to align and praying to whichever deities you prefer is really a safer strategy than actually trying to write to market in the general scheme of things. I mean, the rules of writing don't change in historical fiction any more than they are in modern fiction, really, in that I believe absolutely that the thing that makes any scene come alive on the page is using those specific concrete details of a scene. I mean, for example, if I was describing the scene on the road outside where I am now, and I just said that, you know, there was the sound of traffic going by, well, maybe that gives you a general idea. But if I told you that it was the hiss of the taxi brakes, or the smell of the fast food joint along the way, I'm creating a much more sort of exact picture in your mind. It's part of that telepathy. So one of the things that we have to do when we're researching and thinking about the research is we're looking for those telling details that will bring something to life. Imagine yourself standing on London Bridge in a pre-COVID era when there's actually stuff going on. And think of the sights and the smells that you would be surrounded by. Maybe somebody walking past with too much aftershave on. You know, the bike, somebody weaving past you on a scooter, the sound of a pleasure boat going down the river, or one of those, you know, fast cutters. Then transport yourself back 200 years, 300 years. Now what does it look like? What are the smells and sounds that are going to be different and specific to that area? You know, what are the smells and textures that you will come across? It's particularly important, I think, to remember your other senses as you write. It's very easy to get trapped in a visual world. And so often just getting the right sound in the distance, the right smell, the right texture can really lift something and make people really experience what they're reading rather than just seeing it. You are not just transporting your reader into that particular world. Say, for me, for Paris Winter, that was the world of Paris in 1909. You're transporting your reader into the world of your particular character, which just happens to be in 1909. And that can always be a trouble with historical fiction. We get carried away with our research and the images and everything else, and we forget to try and see it from the perspective of the person whose story we're telling, because they will inevitably be noticing different details, and those can help to really tell a reader about who that person is. If they're hungry, they're going to notice the smells of the hot potato vendor more than they might the smell of the animals going past. If they're a generally very prissy, clean character, then they might be particularly offended by the animal dung smells. Now, all of those things will be telling your reader something really material and concrete that they can see about the scene that's surrounding them, but they will also be telling you something about the character who is observing that scene. And that can that can help you as well. The absolute joy of writing historical fiction is the research, to find all of these details, to find the right ones, to really, you know, create this world and make it really tangible. But of course, research can also go on forever. If I didn't have a mortgage to pay, I would still be on book 2. You know, there's just too much interesting stuff to read in the world. So what I do is I've thought of this, my Christmas tree, as being a way of thinking about how to organize your research and how to organize it into slightly different stages so you don't get completely overwhelmed by it. So let's suppose, and in the handout that Georgina will send at the end, there are a couple of sort of prompts to get you starting thinking about characters or rough ideas if you'd like to. But let's suppose that you all have a fragment of an idea that you want to start exploring in terms of a novel. And that might be an event, it might be a historical event, it might be a particular character that you have an idea of walking around the world. Maybe it's a fragment of a scene or dialogue, or just, you know, something that you've seen in a history book, after a couple of lines. And that's like, you know, a child's drawing of a Christmas tree that goes like this. This is the image I want you to have in your mind. So that fragment is like the little bit of trunk at the bottom that starts it all off. And that first long outward line, that's your first stage of research. And that's the really fun bit. This is the broad general research as you begin to find out something about the period which you're writing in. And for me with Paris Winter, I had an idea of a young woman going out, an English woman going out to study in Paris to train as an artist. And she didn't have very much money, but that was what she wanted to do. So she was going out to Paris to do that. And I found just at the very beginning of that outward line, I knew that she was going to be Edwardian probably. And I realized that there were these floods in Paris in the winter of 1909, 1910. And I thought, God, that's such a fantastic setting for a book. And I've got to have that. So that was basically all I knew. So at that first stage, I just started reading a great deal about Paris, a great deal about art and what the art training was like at the time. Where were we in terms of what was fashionable in Paris? But it was very broad, and also reading broadly about the floods. And this is also one of those great times for serendipity as well, because I was looking through the Times, the London Times, for 1909. And rather than just looking at the articles that were about the flood, I started reading the whole newspaper, including, this was at the period where they had the whole of the front sheet was just covered in adverts. And one of those adverts was for the Aiderly homes for women in Paris, for English women in Paris. And that led me to discover the story of this woman who became, you know, a major character in the book, who had set up these homes for impoverished English women in Paris. And it was that sort of serendipity which you can find on that long outward line. I'd also say that your guide for all of this research and for how to approach research is Donald Rumsfeld, which might come as a surprise to some. If you remember, he gave a speech where he was speaking about intelligence in Iraq, and he said there are known unknowns. So I knew there were floods in Paris. There are known unknowns. I knew I didn't know very much about the art scene or how my people were going to be trained. And then there are unknown unknowns, the things that you don't know. And so that broad line is where you're sort of trying to discover what those unknowns are. It's about reading lots of secondary texts and material. It's about following your curiosity down rabbit holes. Now, I think you should probably always try and set yourself a deadline for how long you're going to spend on that. Because otherwise it can extend into infinity. And it's very important at some point to say, right, now I have to focus in. That's where the next bit of that Christmas tree comes in. because you need to start thinking about what your plot and your story is and choosing your characters before you go too deep into the specifics, because you can't find out everything about Paris in 1909 or France or anything else. You know, you will drive yourself mad doing that. You've got to try and sort of focus in a bit on who your characters are. So for mine, I started looking at the places that a sort of lower middle class English woman would be training in Paris, and find out about these all women ateliers. So that brings my focus in much more tightly. So then I'm finding out in more depth about things which directly affect my characters. You're thinking through a story at this point, you're beginning to develop an idea of who this character is. And it's this time where you want to start really thinking practically about their days. You know, how do they make a living? Where do they live? What's the sort of social and economic pressures that they are under here in this time? But you're thinking of it already specifically from the point of view of your core group of characters, rather than trying to do that for the entire population of Paris. And then as you sort of have made those decisions about those people, you can focus in that research until you really begin to get more of a sense of their lives. Now it's after that that you have to start getting down to that tricky business of actually picking your scenes for your story. What's going to happen when and where? So you're going to start getting more of an idea, for me, of what those ateliers look like. What do the lodging houses look like? And also, of course, key, what was going to happen there? What were my story steps? Which is a whole other MA seminar course, of course. But as I was picking those scenes, I realized that I had a now good visual idea of the sort of people that I was dealing with and where they were and roughly what they were going to do. And gathering images of those specific places and those specific areas of Paris in order to then actually start writing the damn thing. And now this bit is really important. This is the key bit, is that when you're ready to write your scene, you know where the story is going, you know who your characters are, you've got a rough idea of the location and what it looks like and how they're moving around through space. You then have to not stop writing just because you realize you don't know some tiny detail of the scene, because it's fatal. The number of chase scenes where I've completely lost track because I've suddenly started disappearing into some sort of 18th century maps of London to find the street name that they're just about to run into. Feel free at this point when you're writing to just put in X's. Or equally, before I've written a scene, I've decided, oh right, she's definitely going to be doing her boots up while she's talking. And then I spend 3 hours researching 1909 footwear. And then when I write the damn scene, she doesn't put her boots on. It's extremely irritating when that happens. And don't get too caught up in those micro details as you're writing the scene. Let your characters act on the page. If they do something, which means you then have to look something up later, look it up later. Those are those final details, those little bits that you can't find, you didn't know that you needed, or that aren't immediately to hand. That's the star on top of your Christmas tree. High concept really is just the same as in film. It just means that you can put across a strong idea very quickly. So it's Jack the Ripper was really Prince Albert, but that one's been done. It's a novel sort of exposing that. It's a story that you can deliver. In film, it's often called an elevator pitch as well. And it's the sort of thing that will make a publisher or a commercial publisher sort of prick up their ears quite hard. A magic miniature doll's house, perhaps, for the miniaturist. I wouldn't say that Wolf Hall is particularly high concept, but you know, it is a way of, it is the sort of story that you can distill into something quite short, that has immediate sort of commercial appeal. It's very hard if you can't get there physically, obviously. I mean, getting there physically is always the best thing. I mean, the work I did with Wilbur on King of Kings. King of Kings is set in modern Ethiopia. I haven't been there. I mean, obviously, it helps if you're co-writing with Wilbur Smith there. So that gave me a bit of a get out. But one thing that has made our lives a lot easier as writers is YouTube. I found this fantastic German tourist who happened to walk around all of the locations I needed very slowly with their camera phone running, which was incredibly helpful. If you can't get there physically, if YouTube lets you down, one of the things that I will talk about in sources is that it's always very good to read travelers visiting that place, because they will tend to, you know, like all good travel writers, will tend to notice those sorts of details about sights and smells and, you know, differences from their culture, which are very useful for us as writers. Certainly, I found out a lot more about 1909 Paris from foreigners who were going to Paris to look around. They were just much more likely to mention the street cries and that sort of thing than Proust was. That said, if you're setting a large chunk of material in a country you're not familiar with, also make sure that you know their literature as well. And also it depends very much on who your character is again, because my character was an English woman. Those travelers' tales of Paris were ideal for the sort of things she'd noticed. If I was writing with her as a Parisian, then she wouldn't have noticed those things so much. And one has to always, I think, be very careful if you're dealing in a country that you don't know so well. Be careful about your own assumptions about that culture. And often having a foreigner as your avatar in the story can be very helpful if it's not a culture you're familiar with. If you're writing a character who is lives in that world and is part of that culture, then yes, you're giving yourself a very extra important layer of research to make sure that you don't to make sure that you can do that in a convincing way. It would be convincing to somebody who was also from that part of town. When I started writing the Crowther and Westman books, which are 18th century, I had been reading about a book by Amanda Vickery called The Gentleman's Daughter, which is about women of a certain class in the late 18th century. And I was absolutely fascinated by that. It was a sort of social history I didn't know, wasn't aware of. And so for me, it was that period, but also that idea of that particular person whose voice I just hadn't really come across in history. And also, the more I read about the 18th century, because I never learned about it at school, the more fascinating I found it. So these things tend to come hand in hand, but find a character and a story that drives your interest. I tend to go for a close third person. So I'm talking about he did this, she did that, but also we can sort of eavesdrop on their thoughts. I normally have multiple characters where you can slightly eavesdrop on what they're thinking and feeling. And then for me, it's really who is leading the conflict in a particular scene, who has most at stake. Obviously, that's 90% of the time, is going to be one or other of the protagonists. then it's a case of making sure that I don't switch point of view within a scene. Now, I mean, some writers will switch from one character's point of view to another in a scene and make it work. For me, it always sort of like throws me off slightly. If I've been able to hear the thoughts of one person or understand the feelings of one person in a conversation, and then all of a sudden I'm in the other person's head, it feels like the angle has shifted too hard. But in each scene, it really depends on which character has the most sort of emotional weight in a scene. And then when I'm with a Crowther and Westerman, which is very much a two-hander, it's a case of keeping a reasonably even balance between them. So again, it's all of writing is a sort of 4D Tetris where you're constantly doing this mentally and weighing up different options and so on. Again, I think setting deadlines is important, because you will never know as much as you want to, but keep that focus on your character. I will talk about this a bit more when we talk about sort of organizing your research and so on. When you're pulling into your characters, really make sure that you know them and their worlds, because that is the most important bit, is seeing this world from the inside of your character out. So if you find that you've gone off down a particular research rabbit hole into, say, Edwardian footwear, but you can't really remember how that relates to your story, that would be a time I would back away from that particular thing. If, though, I found some article or whatever that mentioned something which really sparked my interest and I could see that coming into the book, then I would spend a bit more time on it. So again, it's more of the 4D Tetris, but I would recommend setting yourself a deadline of when to start your plotting, and then, you know, work on that in a concentrated fashion until you've got some characters and some scenarios sort of settled in your notebook, and then focus your next bit of research on them and their lives. I think it's always best to make them up, because I like, you know, particularly if the book's does really well and people get very interested in it, then it really helps them if they find out that these people are fictional. Because if you use real names of people but the character is entirely fictional, then you stand in danger of confusing people. So I would go for sound-alike names in some ways, or, you know, go and have a look around the churchyard, found interesting names on gravestones, that sort of thing. Come up with your own that sort of sounds like it might be Norman French for an ancient family, something like that. I mean, often in my books there will be elements of the story, even in these and the Westerman and Crowther ones in particular, that even though there are elements of the story that are based on real events, a lot of it will be entirely fictional. But I do love having a historical note at the end to point out to readers where they can find more of the actual history of certain elements. So, for instance, in Island of Bones, there's a lot about folk magic and so on. I found that absolutely fascinating. I loved writing the characters. So I thought that if any readers were like me, they probably want to hear about that too. So you can say in the historical note, these are the real sources and the real people that I've based some of these characters on. Did the same in Theft of Life. Obviously in Wilbur's books, it's clear which are fictional and which are not. And when people are not fictional, I try and stick to the facts as much as I can. Thinking about sort of sources for your research, and perhaps the sort of things that you can do beyond just being sort of stuck in the library. I mean, I think it is very important when you're on that first sort of like long outward bit of your Christmas tree to read some good secondary sources. Read general histories of your period. It's a good way of making sure that there aren't any tricky unknowns sort of hanging around that might trip you up. And also the all the good general histories, popular histories, will have very good footnotes. They'll have good sort of bibliographies at the back, and those can really send you down some very useful paths for primary sources. So say the letters and diaries of particular people that they've quoted from. As you find particular characters or particular sorts of character that you're interested in, then those secondary sources can point you towards that sort of the deep archival stuff, which you would be quite keen to get your hand on if it's, you know, one of the characters that you particularly want to use. So with the Paris winter, those sorts of general books about the floods were incredibly useful to me, as were the primary sources of the contemporary newspapers. Those I think are always full of gems. Once you've settled on a particular year, it is worth, if you can't get access via your library, it is worth getting a subscription to the sort of British newspapers online archive. I've put a link in the notes for this session, and just read around the period of your story, and you'll find all sorts of interesting bits of inspiration there. Wikipedia is a fine place to start. Please do not stop at Wikipedia, and always check whatever is on Wikipedia. But it is certainly a handy reference, and often the articles there have excellent lists of books that relate to the subject that you might not find through sort of just searching Amazon with general terms. Beyond that, though, is sort of where it gets interesting. One of the most important things, I think, is once you've decided on who your characters are and the sort of things that they do for a living, if you possibly can, talk to somebody who does that job now. And it may be that time and technology has vastly changed what is involved in that, but lots of the fundamentals may well be the same. With Paris Winter, I was lucky enough to find an artist who had been trained in exactly the same way as my artist had been trained. And she very kindly let me come round and sit in her studio and ask her stupid questions for an afternoon. It will occasionally take you a few emails to find someone, but you know, every profession has seen their job being wildly misrepresented in the literature. So normally people are keen to help. And for me, what was wonderful about that, being in the painter's studio with her, was the physical textures, the smells. I mean, you know, that the smell of the turpentine, the way that she, you know, was loading her brush with paint, the way she stood relatively to the canvas, that sort of thing, really made all of those scenes and her as a character, my fictional character, sort of alive in a way that I couldn't just have got from a page. And you can, with another one of the Harriet and Crowther ones, I had an automata maker. And I thought that actually finding a modern automata maker might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm glad to say I found one in Scotland who promptly asked me and my husband up. And we went and watched him at work in his workshop as well. So if you can get that sort of first-hand experience, it's really good. And if you ask, with all of these people, but I think with the painter in particular, one of the key things for me was how she talked about her work. As you know, we'll mention dialogue later as well, but there was obviously that with her work hugely affected how she saw the world. So I also took along with her sort of a couple of pictures that I had found on the internet, which I thought weren't very good. But I didn't know why I didn't think they were very good. So I went along and I said, you know, I think this is a rubbish painting, but I don't know why. Please explain it to me. And the 5 minutes that she spent sort of talking about composition and how the light fell and this sort of thing really made me understand how she was looking at the world in a slightly different way. And that was hugely important. So if you can find that sort of thing, do. Also, any sort of experts in a particular corner, if you can talk to someone, it's great. Again, for Paris winter, it involves some diamonds, and so I emailed various patient people on Bond Street to ask if I could come in and ask them about diamonds, and one of them said yes, which was fantastic, because they were the sort of place which have a security guard on front, which I sort of always feel like I feel guilty just walking past the place. I feel like I shouldn't really be allowed to look in at the window. And, you know, so he was showing me these sort of like these 5-carat diamonds. And of course I just stared at them and went, ooh, shiny, because words are my tools. But the way he talked about those stones was really useful. And it made me rewrite a couple of scenes entirely because of things he said. Like, he says, you know, I was asking him about how to tell the difference between a fake and a real. And he just says, you know, once you've seen it enough, you know. So I had to make sure that my diamond expert then had that similar reaction when he saw a fake, to make that convincing. There are some fantastic museums, living museums, that you can go to. There's the Wealden Downland near Chichester, for instance, which is a whole load of vernacular architecture, buildings that have been sort of taken from their original sites and rebuilt on that site. So you can walk into a working watermill. You can see an actual blacksmith's forge. Anything you can find that allows you to really be in the space similar to your characters is really important. So for something like that, and particularly, you know, if you've got a limited budget, it's about where you can go and what you can see. I would say that it is much more important to go where you can see something like that in action than the British Museum, where you may see a whole load of artifacts behind glass, but you're not actually going to see them being used. So do have a look around for your local resources. Local and town museums are better and better for this sort of thing all the time now. All of those interactive displays and things that they do for kids, also very handy for historical writers. And again, coming back to my perennial favorite, YouTube, the fact that if you look at YouTube, there is always an American gentleman who has fired every sort of firearm or weapon in great detail in slow motion videos, and you can watch them again and again. And that was a lot easier for me than and a lot more useful for the writing and the sound of it and the physical action of it than any written description I could have found. So, you know, we do live in a great age for these resources that we can use. I'm just looking at my quick list. I mean, obviously there's an enormous amount of visuals as well. And again, on that handout, I've pointed to a couple of the museums where you can search on their collections online, because a lot there you will find sort of the day-to-day objects that people were using in your period. And those can be a great source of inspiration, and they can also be a great source of that sort of sense of the tangible, because that's where we and the non-fiction historians tend to divide, is that they are telling you about the state of the culture, the things that led up to events, the sort of intellectual, often, history. And it's only recently that we're getting more of that social and material culture. And that material culture was always going to be so important to us as writers. I am sure you can think of dozens more. So just a word on organising all of this material, because obviously gathering it is the fun stuff. I'm almost tempted to show you the absolute disaster area that is my desk, just to convince you that an organisational sort of aptitude is not absolutely necessary for a writer of historical fiction. Here are some of my notes and bits and pieces just from thinking about talking to you guys today. But there are some things that I do always do. And some of those will be, I will always put together a timeline, and I will have a real timeline and a fictional timeline. And my real timeline can get into really sort of day by day details. So with Paris winter, because it's about these floods, obviously the weather is really important. So I actually went through the previous day's weather reports in one of the Paris magazines that I could get online. And so I knew each day what the weather was. As well as when sort of particular significant events happened for that. I also, beyond that timeline, made sure that I knew, you know, okay, so Victoria died then, there's this conflict is going on in this part of the world, this is, you know, Bertie visited Paris, this just about here, the Great Exhibition in Paris was then. Just so I was sort of building up a wider milieu of the period and some of the events that my character might have come across. Most of that you won't use, but you never know. And if, of course, if you are writing a story which does involve real events, real people, or you're using fictional people who are deeply affected by actual historical events, then that timeline becomes more and more important. I also then always try and have my own fictional timeline up against it as well, because part of my research for the character is also, again, that imaginative research. Is when were they born? No. How old are they at this point? You know, when's their birthday roughly? So that I can, when I'm thinking about their backstory, I can see it in that context. And so that might be that when a character was a child, you know, one of their first memories is the news about the death of Queen Victoria, say, which might be of use, might be of significance to the character, and might not be. But it's good for me to have an idea about why those things line up. So timelines are important. Maps. I do love me a map. I mean, who doesn't? And I had, now I think about it, I was probably just avoiding getting on with the actual writing, but I had a great fun with sort of mapping the floods across Paris. Again, to see what happened day by day. And also so that I then had on my computer somewhere that I could see, okay, this is exactly what was happening on that day. So I could just have a quick read of that and remind myself of it before I started writing a particular scene. Images. Now, within my research folders, what I will tend to do is, if there's a location that I'm going to be spending a lot of time at, I'll have a folder that's called, you know, Atelier. And then all of the relevant images that I can find can go into that place. And then if another location is Notre Dame, then I'll find all the contemporary images that I can find of that one, and they will go into that folder. If I'm constructing in a purely imaginative space, like one of the Westminster and Crowther houses, then I will gather all of my sort of scrapbook material for that house into that folder. Again, so that I can have a quick squiz through before I'm writing a scene. Just the sort of bits and pieces that they might have around them. I also will tend to sketch out maps of houses, imaginary or not, just to see how this person's geography works, the geography of their particular house. And You don't need to do that for every single scene, but it is very useful if it is a place that you'll be coming back to on a regular basis. Sometimes if it's just a particular room, there might only be 1 or 2 images, so rather than having a whole folder, I'll just have that in a general reference file. I also keep handy my list of YouTube links, so that I know when there's a gun scene, that I don't have to spend all the time going through all the links again. But I know there was this guy that was using the right sort of black powder, and here's an image from an auction site of a gun of the right period. And also I will have files for particular characters. Aside from the guns, YouTube is very, very good for clothes. And there are enough fantastic reenactors and makers out there who demonstrate how to sort of get dressed in all sorts of period costumes and so on. And I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the clothes, but some of those videos are just so good at showing you what it was physically like to wear these things of different periods, how much they could move and they couldn't move, how comfortable stays were, all of these bits and pieces. And even if none of that gets onto the page, it's all feeding your imagination and your idea of that character, because again, you're seeing the world from inside their skin out. So, you know, that environment and also what's physically close to them is important. Same with food. I like to know what they're eating. So amongst all of my key texts and things, there'll probably be extracts from cookbooks and so on. Now, there are plenty of times that you don't want that, again, to end up on the page. I remember I had a scene in one book towards the end, just as things were getting exciting, where the family had been sitting down for dinner. Then somebody comes in just as they're getting going, makes a shocking announcement, and everybody's off to the races. You know, everyone's sort of going off in different directions. And the copy editor at the time did say, you know, oh, I'd quite like to know what they're eating. And I thought, if people really care what they're eating at this point, then I've not done my job right as a writer. Because, you know, you should be worrying about what the hell's going on. You know, you should feel like they do. The food is not the important thing. But at the same time, if you are trying to fully imagine these characters, fully imagine the world, then having an idea what they subsist on day to day is a good idea. So organize that as much as you can, gather in sort of bits and pieces so that you can have a quick look at things before you start writing a scene. But remember, it's not an exam. You don't need to have all of this off by heart. And you will also find your sort of key texts. If you're like me and you can never remember the names of the different carriages and this sort of thing, you know, you find your great carriage book, and it is there whenever you are writing a book of that period. And I admit, when I've been writing some of the military stuff with Wilbur, I have these fantastic Osprey guides which give me all the right jargon for the clothes and things. It goes into my head as I read it and write it, and then out the other end. Please don't quiz me on late 19th century firearms. But it's good to know where they are, so that when you're getting to your Christmas tree star at the top, you can take out the bits where you just say gun, and you can put in the proper words. So a couple of things about common problems with historical fiction, and how I go about trying to avoid them anyway. I'd say a word first about dialogue. Dialogue is particularly difficult in historical fiction, because, as we know from even just sort of looking back through the archives that we now have of the last 100 years of sound and so on, accents change, language changes all the time, and there is always an element when you're writing historical fiction, I think, of translation. Now, some people like Ben Kane and Tony Riches, who write about Roman soldiers, their Roman soldiers sound like modern squaddies. you know, they swear like squatters. Their cadence of their language is like that. They're not trying to make it sound like they are actually speaking ancient Latin. With the 18th century, for instance, it is very difficult to find out how anyone spoke once you get beyond the sort of letters and diaries, which are obviously slightly mannered and only coming from a particular class. There are some places that you can find things like the Old Bailey online archives, where you actually have verbatim testimony from individuals. You will occasionally come across something like that. I remember finding a verbatim account of a woman in Borrowdale in 1785, which was amazing at giving me a sense of the accent of the period. But again, it's not something that I would ever want to directly reproduce on the page, because it can be too distancing for the author, for the reader. Personally, and this is just personally speaking, I will try and avoid language which sounds too modern, even when it's right for the period. Because sometimes you'll see a phrase in a letter and it'll sound like a teenager on the bus yesterday, but you know, if you put it in the context of a page in a historical novel, it will throw the reader out of that. I personally dislike the idea of reproducing any kind of accents or non-RP speech with sort of, you know, all right, governor, and apostrophes all over the place. I think it tends to look a bit pretty patronizing. And it does sort of buy into this idea that there is one language which is RP and that's proper, and everything else is some sort of like truncated version of that. Let your book find its own voice, but I would always recommend look for cadence and look for dialogue words when you're distinguishing where people come from or their class, rather than do anything rather than sound like Dick Van Dyke on the page. Basically, that's the key thing. And the big thing with dialogue is, just as when we speak to each other today, I think there's a quote from My Fair Lady which said that no English person can open their mouths without another English person despising them. We reveal an enormous amount about ourselves by the words we choose. Again, in that handout, I've just given you an example. For instance, say, you know, think of somebody walking into a coffee shop and the number of different ways you can say thank you, and what that reveals about your background, where you come from, how you want to be perceived that day. You tell people an awful lot about your character every time you open your mouth as well. So again, that's why it's very important with dialogue, just as with the research and your details, is come from the inside out. Start with the character. Who is speaking? Why are they saying what they're saying? What mood are they in? What do they want out of that conversation? Do they want people to like them? Do they want some piece of information? Do they want to convince somebody of something else? How is that individual going to express that? And if you think of it that way, then all of your characters should be able to find their own voices, their own cadences. And just a word on swearing. Every writer still gets letters complaining about swearing in their books. It is, funnily enough, often something that needs translating too, because of the changing mores in different centuries. You'll find that, say, there are different periods where sexual swear words weren't as offensive as they might be now, but sorts of blasphemy or would be. So when you're doing that, do think carefully about whether you want to stay faithful to what we think we know about the period usage, or if you want to make sure that the reader has an immediate understanding of the level of the seriousness of the swearing in the line. So again, it's all very individual, but be aware of that with that and with slang. One word on anachronistic attitudes. The past, and a lot of people in it had some pretty grim attitudes about women, about different races. The sort of generalized sort of misogyny and xenophobia can be quite hard to read in contemporary texts from 1909 or from the 18th century, as you can imagine. I personally believe that there have always been plenty of people who would question those attitudes and question those roles, but also a lot of people wouldn't. I mean, particularly sort of thinking about the role of women in society. The assumptions that were made about women's intelligence or role in life or ability to function outside the home were so widespread that they didn't need saying very often. And one thing I do find difficult in some historical fiction is where you have sort of standard annoying man will walk into a scene and deliver a thing about how a woman's place is in the home, and education being wasted on a women, and then sort of turn around and walk out again. I think it's much more interesting when you're exploring those sorts of attitudes is to see them in action, dramatize them. So it's much better, I think, to have a character express the wish to get educated and register the surprise on the faces of the people around her than to be too on the nose about those attitudes. Let them bubble up through the whole setting of your novel and everything else, rather than hitting people over the head with things. Which brings me to my final thing, which is the danger of the info dump. Has anybody heard that phrase before? It's basically that bit in many novels where somebody just sort of like stops the story, almost like they put out their hand, and gives you a page and a half of background, or the sort of a brief history of the latest wars. One of the big giveaways of that sort of thing, and it being a problem, is if one character turns to another and says, "As you know." I mean, seriously, if they're saying "as you know" to the other character, why on earth are they saying it? You see it a lot in films as well, and it's that moment where one character turns to the other and say, "Well, now that we've been working on this ground-breaking super monkey serum for 7 years, let's hope that nobody ever takes it away. I'll just put down this vial of the very important stuff on the table just here, and then we can leave for lunch." And it's like, what did she think she'd been doing for the last 7 years if she's just finding out now that it was the super monkey serum? I mean, it happens a lot in historical fiction. And it's always really hard, because a lot of the time you've just been so excited by your research you want to share it, but it's very important to try and find subtle ways to get the information in that your readers need to know without an "as you know" moment. There are lots of ways to do it, again, to take an example from sci-fi, Minority Report, for instance, is a classic of this. The characters who are in Minority Report are not going to explain the whole setup to each other. So what they do is actually quite late in the after the sort of main action intro, they have a moment where they've got a group of kids who are watching an intro video about the setup, while something else interesting is going on with Tom Cruise trying to sneak back in. So that gives the readers a sort of, that gives the viewers the information that they may need, but in a way that feels natural and doesn't slow the story. Again, think of it from the inside of your character out. It may be that they had a traumatic experience on the day that Queen Victoria died. But you can, in the retelling of that experience, also say a lot about how the nation felt about it or what the reactions were. The use of the radio playing in the background while your characters are doing something else. The discarded newspaper headlines. The overheard conversations. All of this life that can do all of this sort of the research that you've done, and should always bubble up through people moving in the world, through people, your protagonists experiencing the world. Again, it's got to come inside out, and then you, as being, you know, godlike writers, can put things in their way that can remind them of something that happened in the first days of the war when X, Y, and Z, or can shock them with some new headline. They're sort of walking along thinking about one thing and then gathering around the windows of the TV shop as people realize that Kennedy has been shot. You know, just never info dump. Use your imaginations. That's what they're for. And you will always find some good and exciting ways to get through those moments. Please just always approach all of your storytelling, all of your research. Ignore that old shibboleth of write what you know. Write what you want to know. And approach your stories and your characters, approach it with empathy, curiosity, imagination, and you won't go far wrong. I do think that I'm very glad to say it's changing a bit at the moment, that we are getting published in the UK more interesting international historical fiction, and though obviously, you know, Wilbur's always written about Africa, we are now getting more voices of Black British writers who are looking for stories outside the UK, as well as within it. I mean, for instance, Vasim Khan and Abir Mukherjee, two fantastic crime writers who I highly recommend you read. Their novels are set in India, and are absolutely brilliant. The publishing, they do tend to be a bit conservative and a bit parochial, so they do like things that they feel that readers will more easily engage, let us say, with a lot of stuff that is UK based from UK writers. But that's not entirely true. You know, everything, every time you kind of come up with a rule like this, things will change. If you're looking for sales in America, then having American characters or American scenes, they tend to think that's where their audience are listening to. But then, as Georgina said, my last book I wrote with Darby Keeley is set mostly in France and has sold in 25 countries. So, you know, there are always exceptions to the rule. Follow your story. Follow, you know, if you want to write a story that is set anywhere in the world, then write it. I mean, if as long as you know it, as long as you know that place, then you should be able to create it for the reader. And then, as always, in terms of sales and what's deemed marketable or not, we are to a degree in the lap of the gods. So again, don't follow the market, follow your curiosity. It was probably relatively good in terms of the way people tended to form their sentences and so on. In certain circumstances, but in the same way, we don't sound like novelists would always make us sound, because we all speak with too many ums and ers, and we all have our own particular idiolects. It shouldn't be taken as a model. I would also think very carefully about taking a very direct model from, say, the contemporary fiction or the diaries of and letters of Fanny Burney, because it's very easy to tip into pastiche if you're not careful. and it will sound to somebody reading now like somebody doing an impersonation of the 18th century. So you can actually lose your readers by trying to get a bit closer. Again, start from the inside out. But I mean, in terms of vocabulary used and so on, then yes, I think that they're a very good source. It so depends, and it's really interesting because this book Liberation that I worked on with Darby Keeley, it started life as a Hollywood film. So for a Hollywood film, it's incredibly historically accurate. For historical fiction, it's wildly made up. You know, I mean, it's full of sort of big Hollywood set pieces, which, though there are reasons for them being there, are definitely divergent from the record. I would always rather stick to the facts, which is why I tend to populate my historical fiction with imaginary people, so that I have as much room as possible. And it depends on the project. Like, for instance, in King of Kings, I mean, the battle formations, the names of the generals, the actions of the different leaders and so on are as near to what I know happened as I can possibly get. So it does vary slightly project to project. I would be happy moving things around a bit. I did move around some of the streets that were flooded in Paris winter. But then I tend to always have a historical note at the end to say, you know, this bit I made up, this bit is real, this bit is real-ish. So again, it's very personal. But wherever I am distorting things which purport to be mostly true, then I will try and take proper note of that in some form. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think often you can do 90% of somebody's backstory, you know, just through those occasional memories. And you don't need to have sort of like fully constructed flashback scenes. It's part of the laying out the framework of your novel. Sometimes if you're telling a longer story that has its own sort of beginning, middle and end in flashback sequences, then you want to do that as sort of definitely, you know, 2 line breaks, and then you're off into the past. And then at other times you just want to give a certain color and background and a bit more of an idea of who this person is. And when, yes, it's indirect speech as they are thinking and remembering something, and then, yes, just a few lines while they are walking down the street is absolutely fine. I don't know. I think the sort of always is a bit of never say never. And whenever I think I've crossed something off my list, I almost immediately change my mind. I think there are certain sorts of Dark Ages and Roman that for just some reason don't particularly appeal to me, but I already have germs of ideas which are sort of, you know, 11th century. So I've gone back sort of 700 years from where I started already. So who knows where I'll end up.